Chapter 3 of Molly Brown's Senior Days by Nell Speed. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Gossip over the teacups. The gloom that had been hanging over Wellington since Professor Green's illness gradually lifted as the young man steadily improved. Each morning Molly received the latest news from one of the nurses. Miss Grace was never visible. She was sitting up at night with her brother and slept during the day. One morning Molly encountered not the day nurse but Miss Alice Fern in the hall of the infirmary. She was dressed in white linen and might have been taken for a postgraduate nurse, except that she wore no cap. Miss Fern had a cold greeting for Molly and for Judith Blunt, also, who presently joined them. "Edwin is much better," she informed them. "He is seeing people now, isn't he?" asked Judith eagerly. Miss Fern stiffened. "No," she answered, "only me, and his brother and sister, of course." She added this as an afterthought. "It will be many weeks before he is allowed to see any of the Wellington people. The doctor is particularly anxious for him not to be reminded of his work. Excitement would be very dangerous for him." "Is that what the doctor says, or is that your verdict, Alice?" put in Judith, who had small liking for the professor's cousin on the other side of the family. "I'm in entire authority here," answered Miss Fern, in such a hostile tone that Molly felt as if they had been accused of forcing their way into the sick room. "I am nursing during the day in conjunction with the infirmary nurse." "Why don't you wear a cap, Alice?" asked Judith tauntingly. "It would make you look more like the real thing." With a hurried excuse, Molly hastened out of the hall. It went against her grain to be involved in the quarrels of Alice Fern and Judith Blunt. She was walking rapidly toward the village when she heard Judith's voice behind her calling, "Wait, and I'll walk with you. I see you're going my way. I had to stay and give a last dig to that catty Alice Fern," she added breathlessly, catching up with Molly. Molly smiled. She didn't know but that she agreed with Judith, but it was not her way to call people cats. "I'm so glad you arranged to take the postgrad, Judith," she began as they started down the avenue. "Isn't it great?" answered Judith exultingly. "It's all Madeline's doing, you know. We've had a wonderful summer, Molly, almost the first summer I can remember when I wasn't bored." "What have you two been up to?" Molly asked with some curiosity. The cloak of enthusiasm was a new one for Judith to wear, and it was very becoming to her, Molly thought. "We've been making money," Judith announced with sparkling eyes. "I've made almost enough to carry me through another year here." Goodness, Molly thought. How the world does change. Think of the proud Judith working and then telling me about it. Me whom she used to detest. It's been jolly fun too, and I didn't mind the work a bit. "I hope you made a great deal," remarked Molly, not liking to ask too many questions, but burning to know how money had been made by a girl who had once stamped her foot and declared she would never work for a living. A friend of Brother Richard's, an actor, lent him his bungalow on the coast for the summer, and Mamma and Madeline and I spent 4 months in it, with Richard down for the weekends. It was a pretty bungalow with a big living room and a broad piazza at the back looking right out to sea, and Madeline conceived the notion of opening a tea room there. Richard was willing, and so was Mamma, and we started in right away. Madeline had all sorts of schemes for advertising in the post office and at the general store, and at last we had a sign painted and hung out in front on the post. The coast road goes by the house, and streams of automobiles are passing all day long, so that we began to have lots of customers immediately. I don't know how it happened, but it was sort of a fashionable meeting place for all the people in the neighborhood. Pretty soon we had to buy dozens of little blue teapots and crates of cup and saucers and plates. Even Mama helped with the sandwiches, and Richard too, when he could come down. But you should have seen Madeline. Every afternoon she put a cap and apron and turned waitress. She served everybody. She was the neatest, quickest, prettiest little waiting maid you ever saw. Mama and I worked in the kitchen filling orders. Sometimes the sandwiches would give out, and then Mama and I and Bridget, our Irish maid, who has stayed with us through everything, would slice bread like mad. Madeline knew dozens of different ways of making sandwiches. We used to make up dishes of fillings ahead of time and keep them on ice. Sometimes at night we were so tired we'd simply fall into bed, but we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, and we had a splendid time in spite of the hard work. "I think you are wonderful," cried Molly. "I should never even have hoped to make anything like that go." "It's Madeline who is the wonder," broke in Judith loyally. "She has the brains and energy of a real genius." "Are you down at O'Reilly's this winter? I haven't seen either one of you to speak to before." "Oh yes, we have the same old rooms. I'm working up in 2 or 3 different subjects and taking a course in physical culture with a view to teaching it. You know, we are going to open a school, Madeline and I." "Where?" demanded Molly, filled with interest in her old-time enemy's schemes. "We don't know yet. It may be in the South. Madeline has 2 more years here. I shall go to Paris next year for a course at the Sorbonne, so that I shall be up in French by the time we are ready to start." Molly was almost too amazed over the change in Madeline had wrought in Judith to comment politely on the glowing future Judith mapped out for herself. She recalled how Judith had once insulted the little Southern girl at a Semaphore ball, and she remembered how Madeline had said, "I shall make a friend of her yet. You'll see." "I wish I could make plans and stick to them," Molly thought. "How can I ever get anywhere when I don't even know where I want to get? If I am not to teach school, then what am I to do?" Many times a day Molly asked herself this question. There were times during the summer when she heard the call still infinitely far away to write, and on hot afternoons when the others were napping she would steal down to the big cool parlor with a pencil and pad. Here in the quiet of the darkened room, with strained mind and thoughts on tiptoe for inspiration, she would try to write, but the stories were crude and childish. Sometimes she would read over Professor Green's letter of advice about writing. "Be as simple and natural as if you were writing a letter," he had said, and her efforts to be natural and simple were invariably elaborately studied and self-conscious. "I don't see why I want to do what I can't do," she would cry with despair in her heart, and then the next day perhaps she would try it again. So it was that Molly had a feeling of unrest that was quite new to her. It was like entertaining a stranger within the gates to admit this unfamiliar spirit into her mind, And now, as she parted with Judith with a friendly handclasp, she felt the dissatisfaction more keenly than ever before. Her errand in the village that afternoon was really to call on Mrs. Murphy, who, you will recall, was once housekeeper for Queen's. For many months the good soul had been laid up with rheumatism, and for the sake of old times the Queen's girls plied her with attentions. The Murphys now lived in a small cottage near the depot, and they were exceedingly poor, since the office of baggage master brought in only a small pay. But Mrs. Murphy, crippled as she was, her fingers knotted at the joints like the limbs of an old apple tree's, managed to keep her room shining with neatness. "And it's glad I am to see you, miss," exclaimed the good woman, much aged since the days at Queen's. She led Molly through a little hallway into the kitchen opening upon a small garden, now bright with rows of cosmos, graceful and delicate in color, and brilliant masses of vari-colored, ragged chrysanthemums. "It's the little Japanese lady that tended my garden for me all summer, miss. She may be a heathen, but she's as good as gold. Our blessed mother herself could not have been kinder." Molly's heart was filled with admiration for Otoyo, who instead of moping about by herself all summer, had been making herself useful. "I'm ashamed," she thought. "Madeline and Judith and Otoyo all make me feel awfully ashamed." In the meantime, Mrs. Murphy had spread a cloth on the little kitchen table and laid out her best cups and saucers. It was her heart's delight to drink tea with the young ladies. "And how is the poor gentleman, Mr. Edwin, I mean?" "He is getting better every day, Mrs. Murphy, and I'm that glad to hear the news. It would have been a sad day for the poor young lady if she had lost him, though, may the Holy Mother forgive me for saying it, she's not good enough for the likies of him, I'm thinking." "Let me pour the tea for you, Mrs. Murphy," Molly interposed, taking the blue teapot out of Mrs. Murphy's crippled hands after it had been filled with boiling water. "What young lady did you say it was?" she asked presently, her eyes on a tea leaf swirling round and round in her cup. "'Tis Miss Fern, the gentleman's cousin, and they do say they're to be married before spring. I'm not saying she ain't pretty, miss. She's prettier than most, and she's kind to the gentleman. Oh, you may be sure, but she's got a different set of banners for him. And the day she had tea here with little Miss Sen and the professor, she was all graces, to be sure. But another day she was here to meet him, and little Miss Sen brought the message he could not come. It was a regular spitfire she was that day, miss, and no mistake. So that was why the professor had wanted the blue paperweight. Perhaps there was some reason in his delirium after all. "Have you seen her, miss?" asked Mrs. Murphy. "Oh, yes," answered Molly. "I think she is very pretty. May I look at your garden, Mrs. Murphy? Dear little Otoyo, I can see her working out here in the flowers. Don't you just love her, Mrs. Murphy?" But the Irish woman had gone into the next room to get an old pair of shears. "I'll take it as a favor, Miss Molly, if you'll cut 2 bunches, one for yourself and one for the professor. God bless him, and the saints preserve him for strength and happiness, though I ain't saying I wish him to be preserved for Miss Alice Fern, pretty though she be." When Molly appeared at the hospital some half an hour later, she made a picture the infirmary nurses would soon not forget. "These are for Professor Green from Mrs. Murphy," Molly said, giving the nurse the largest half of the bunch. The nurse gave her a long, quizzical look. She was new at Wellington and not familiar with the girls. "Are you Miss Molly Brown?" she asked suddenly. "Why, yes," answered Molly, surprised. "I thought so," said the nurse, and departed before the astonished Molly could say another word. End of chapter 3.